Caleb Walker's motorcycle hummed softly as he coasted down the endless stretch of highway. The Texas sun dipped low, painting the horizon in hues of orange and purple. The desert air whispered past him, carrying with it a fleeting sense of freedom he hadn't felt in years. His fingers tightened on the handlebars as his eyes flickered to the rearview mirror. No shadows followed him yet, but he knew better than to trust the calm. He wasn't running from anything, at least, that's what he told himself. But the worn duffel bag strapped to the back of his bike and the restless nights spent in roadside motels told a different story. Caleb was a man trying to outrun ghosts that clung to his heels no matter how far he rode. A flickering neon sign appeared in the distance, signaling a gas station and diner. Caleb pulled in, his boots crunching against the gravel as he dismounted. The place looked like it hadn't been updated since the 70s, faded paint, cracked windows, and a single pump that squeaked when he set it to fill his tank. Inside the diner, the air smelled of grease and stale coffee. A jukebox played a country ballad from some forgotten era. Caleb ordered black coffee and a slice of pie, settling into a corner booth where he could watch the door. Years of habit made him instinctively map out the exits. His quiet observation was interrupted by raised voices near the entrance. A group of bikers had entered, leather jackets, tattoos, and an air of arrogance that clung to them like smoke. Caleb noticed the patch on their backs, a snake wrapped around a pair of crossed wrenches. Iron fangs. He didn't need an introduction to know trouble when he saw it. A petite waitress, her face pale but determined, tried to avoid their gaze as she refilled coffee cups. Caleb followed her movements, noticing how one of the bikers, stocky with a shaved head and a jagged scar running down his cheek, blocked her path. "Come on, sweetheart," the biker sneered. "Smile for me." The waitress stiffened, clutching the coffee pot like a lifeline. Caleb's jaw tightened, but he stayed still, waiting. "Hey, Zeke, let her do her job," another biker said, though his tone lacked conviction. Zeke ignored him, stepping closer to the waitress. She tried to sidestep him, but he grabbed her wrist. The coffee pot clattered to the floor, shattering into pieces. Caleb was on his feet before he could stop himself. "That's enough," he said, his voice low but sharp. The room went still. Zeke turned, sizing him up. "And who the hell are you?" "Just someone who doesn't like seeing a woman harassed," Caleb replied, keeping his tone even. The rest of the gang stood, chairs scraping against the floor. Caleb's senses sharpened. His muscles coiled, ready. "You've got guts," Zeke said, stepping closer. "But guts don't mean much when you're outnumbered." "Neither does stupidity," Caleb shot back. For a moment, it seemed like Zeke would lunge at him. But the door to the diner opened, and an older man wearing a sheriff's badge walked in. "Everything okay here?" the sheriff asked, his eyes narrowing at the group of bikers. Zeke backed off, muttering under his breath. "We're leaving." The gang filed out, but not before Zeke paused at the door to point at Caleb. "This ain't over." Caleb didn't respond. He waited until the bikers were gone before sitting back down. The waitress knelt to clean up the broken glass, her hands shaking. "Leave it," Caleb said gently, crouching to help her. "Thank you," she whispered. I didn't know what to do." "You did fine," he replied, handing her the largest shards. "What's your name?" "Lila. Lila Carson." "Nice to meet you, Lila." He offered her a faint smile. The sheriff approached, nodding at Caleb. "Name's Holt. I appreciate you stepping in, but you might have stirred up a hornet's nest." "The Iron Fangs don't take well to being embarrassed." "Not my first time dealing with guys like that," Caleb said. Holt studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Figured as much. Still, keep your head down. This town doesn't need any more trouble." Caleb didn't argue. He knew better than anyone that trouble had a way of finding him whether he wanted it or not. As he stepped outside to check his bike, the horizon seemed darker. The desert no longer felt as open and free. Instead, it pressed in around him, heavy with the weight of something unseen. He climbed back onto his motorcycle, but as he started the engine, he spotted the reflection of headlights in the distance. A group of bikes rumbled down the highway, their silhouettes unmistakable against the setting sun. Caleb exhaled slowly. Trouble wasn't coming. It was already here. Caleb rode hard, but the sound of engines trailing him never faded. The Iron Fangs weren't just following, they were hunting. He glanced in his side mirror and counted 4 bikes, their headlights glaring against the darkening sky. Gravel crunched as his tires hugged the shoulder, and he pushed his machine faster, the vibrations rattling through his bones. The road stretched ahead, empty and unforgiving, bordered by dry brush and barren land. There was nowhere to hide. The lead biker, Zeke, closed the distance. Caleb knew he couldn't outrun them, not on terrain like this. He had to make a stand. Spotting a dirt path veering off to the side, Caleb swerved sharply, kicking up dust and debris as he cut through the landscape. The narrow trail forced the bikers to follow single file, slowing their pursuit. He rode hard for another quarter-mile before the path ended abruptly at the edge of a ravine. "Perfect," he muttered. Caleb killed the engine and dismounted, moving quickly to take cover behind a cluster of rocks. His hands instinctively checked the small folding knife strapped to his boot, hardly ideal, but it would have to do. He crouched low, steadying his breathing as the roar of the bikes grew louder. The first rider barreled into the clearing, and Caleb struck fast. He swept the man's legs out from under him, sending him sprawling into the dirt. The second biker skidded to a stop, but Caleb was already on him, twisting his arm until he dropped the crowbar he carried. A sharp elbow to the face left the man groaning on the ground. Zeke was next. He stepped off his bike slowly, a chain wrapped around his fist. "You should have kept riding," Zeke growled. Caleb straightened, his muscles coiled. "You should have picked a better fight." Zeke lashed out, swinging the chain in a wide arc. Caleb dodged, grabbing a nearby length of rebar from the dirt. The two circled each other, weapons clashing in a metallic rhythm. Zeke struck again, but Caleb ducked low and drove his shoulder into the man's ribs, knocking him backward. "You think this is over?" Zeke spat, scrambling to his feet. Blood dripped from a gash above his eye. Caleb stepped closer, his voice low and controlled. "Walk away, Zeke. Take your men and leave. Or next time, I won't be so kind." For a moment, Zeke hesitated. Then the sound of more engines approaching broke the tension. Reinforcements. Caleb's chest tightened. He backed away, sprinting toward his bike. He had no choice but to abandon the wrecked machine and take off on foot. The shadows swallowed him as he disappeared into the ravine. Behind him, Zeke's furious voice echoed through the night. "We'll find you." Caleb didn't look back. He didn't need to. He already knew they would. Caleb's boots crunched against dry gravel as he stumbled through the ravine, his breath shallow and sharp. Blood trickled down his arm from a gash near his shoulder, but he pushed the pain aside. The night closed in, shadows stretching long across the desert floor. Somewhere in the distance, engines roared before fading, the bikers circling like wolves on the hunt. He needed shelter. A faint glimmer of light blinked through the trees ahead, a farmhouse, isolated and worn but alive. Caleb hesitated for only a moment before pressing forward. His legs ached, his body bruised, but survival demanded movement. When he reached the porch, he knocked twice, hard enough to echo but not enough to startle whoever might be inside. He leaned against the railing, his vision swimming as the door creaked open. It was her. Lila Carson froze when she saw him, her eyes wide with shock. "You again?" Caleb tried to straighten up, but his knees buckled. "I need a place to lay low," he muttered before his legs gave out completely. Lila caught him, struggling under his weight. "Oh my God, come on." She dragged him inside, guiding him to an old couch that sagged under his bulk. "What happened to you?" "Ran into your friends," Caleb said, wincing as she peeled back his shirt sleeve to examine the wound. "They're not my friends," she shot back, already moving to grab a first aid kit from the kitchen. Caleb's eyes swept the room, wood-paneled walls, faded curtains, and a fireplace that hadn't been lit in years. It felt lived in, but lonely, like the house itself was waiting for someone to fill the empty spaces. Lila returned, her hands trembling as she cleaned his wound. "They did this?" "They tried," Caleb said. "Didn't expect me to fight back." She paused, her eyes locking with his. "You don't seem like someone who backs down from much." "Not anymore." Silence settled between them as she finished wrapping his arm. Caleb studied her as she worked, determined but fragile, like someone who had spent years learning how to stand her ground without ever feeling safe. "You should go," Lila said finally, sitting back. "The iron fangs, they don't let things go. If they know you're here, they'll come for me." Caleb finished the sentence for her. "I know." "Then why stay?" Caleb leaned forward, his voice steady. "Because running doesn't work. Not for people like me." Lila's expression softened, and for the first time, Caleb saw something other than fear in her eyes. He saw understanding. "They killed my dad," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Caleb frowned. "The gang?" She nodded. He tried to stand up to them, refused to pay for protection. "They called it an accident, but everyone knew." She swallowed hard. "And now my brother. Eli, he's with them." Caleb's jaw tightened. "That kid I saw at the diner?" "Yeah." She shook her head. "He's not like them, not yet. But Roy has him convinced it's the only way to survive in this town." Caleb exhaled slowly, the pieces falling into place. He wasn't just up against a gang, he was up against a system of fear that had taken root and refused to let go. "Then maybe it's time someone reminded them what fear feels like," he said, standing despite the ache in his muscles. Lila stared at him, uncertain. "You really think you can stop them?" "I don't know," Caleb admitted. "But I'm not going to let them win without a fight." For the first time that night, Lila smiled. It was small and cautious, but it was enough. "You'll need more than fists and stubbornness," she said, walking toward a locked cabinet in the corner. She pulled out a hunting rifle and handed it to him. Caleb took it, the weight familiar in his hands. "I'm not here to start a war," he said carefully. Lila's eyes hardened. "Maybe not, but if you're staying, you'd better be ready to end one." The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty yard as Caleb stood by the porch, cradling the hunting rifle. His muscles ached, and his shoulder throbbed under the tight bandages Lila had wrapped the night before. But pain was nothing new, it was just another reminder that he was still alive. He scanned the horizon, watching for dust trails that might signal approaching bikes. So far, nothing. But he knew better than to trust the stillness. Inside, Lila moved quietly, boiling water for coffee and pacing the length of the small kitchen. Her nerves showed in the way her fingers tapped against the counter and the way she glanced out the window every few minutes. "They'll come," Caleb said, not bothering to look back at her. She stopped pacing. "How can you be so sure?" "Because they're cowards," he replied. "And cowards don't walk away from a fight unless they're forced to." Lila crossed her arms, leaning against the doorway. "What happens when they show up?" "You're just one man, Caleb. You can't take them all." Caleb finally turned, meeting her worried gaze. "I don't need to take them all," he said. "I just need to make them think twice." Before Lila could respond, the distant rumble of engines broke the silence. Her breath caught, and Caleb's grip on the rifle tightened. "They're here." Lila darted to the back room, grabbing a small pistol from the nightstand drawer. Her hands shook as she checked the safety. "Stay inside," Caleb said firmly. "I'm not hiding," she shot back. "You're not fighting either." His voice softened. "Please, Lila. I need you alive when this is over." Reluctantly, she nodded and stepped back. Caleb moved to the edge of the porch as the bikes rolled into view, kicking up clouds of dust. 5 of them this time, led by Zeke and Roy Tucker. Roy dismounted first. He wasn't as big as Zeke, but what he lacked in size, he made up for in presence. The leather jacket he wore was patched with years of battles, each scar on the fabric a mark of dominance. "Well, well," Roy said, his voice loud enough to echo across the yard. "Looks like you found yourself a little hideout." Caleb didn't respond. Roy smirked. "You got guts, I'll give you that. But guts don't mean much when you're outnumbered." Zeke stepped forward, his eyes burning with hatred. The gash Caleb had given him 2 nights before was now bandaged, but the anger hadn't healed. "Let's just end this," Zeke growled. "No more warnings." Caleb raised the rifle slightly, but not enough to aim. "I already told you to walk away." "And I already told you this ain't over," Zeke snapped. Roy held up a hand, silencing him. His eyes locked on Caleb. "You're a soldier, aren't you? I can see it. The way you stand, the way you look at us. You're not afraid to pull the trigger." Caleb's jaw tightened. Roy stepped closer. "Thing is, we've seen your type before, big men with big plans. And do you know what happens to them?" Caleb didn't flinch. "They survive." Roy's smirk faltered for just a second before he gestured to his men. "Teach him a lesson." 2 of the bikers moved forward, weapons drawn, chains and crowbars. Caleb didn't hesitate. He fired a warning shot into the dirt near their feet, making them jump back. "Next one won't miss," Caleb warned. Roy held up a hand again, stopping the others. "Not yet," he said, stepping forward. "You want to play the hero? Fine. But this town doesn't need heroes. It needs men who know their place." "Like Eli?" Caleb asked, his voice cutting through the air. Roy's eyes narrowed. "Leave him out of this." Caleb took a step forward. "He's still a kid. He doesn't belong with you." Roy's face darkened. "Eli made his choice. And I'm not about to let some outsider tell me how to run my crew." "That's your problem, Roy," Caleb said. "You don't lead, you control. And one day, they'll turn on you." Roy clenched his fists, but before he could respond, a voice called out from behind him. "Stop!" It was Eli. He stepped out from behind the bikes, his face pale but determined. "This isn't right," he said, looking directly at Roy. "Go home, Eli," Roy barked. No, Eli swallowed hard and looked at Caleb. "I'm not like them. Not anymore." Zeke lunged, grabbing Eli by the collar, but Caleb raised the rifle again. "Let him go," Caleb ordered. For a tense moment, no one moved. Then Zeke shoved Eli aside and backed off. "This isn't over," Roy said, his voice low and dangerous. "You don't get to walk away from this." "Neither do you," Caleb replied. The bikers mounted their bikes and rode off, but Caleb knew they'd be back, and next time, they wouldn't come to talk. He turned to Eli, who stood trembling but unbroken. "You did the right thing," Caleb said. Eli met his gaze. "I hope so." Behind them, Lila stepped onto the porch, her pistol still in hand. "This is far from over," she said softly. Caleb nodded, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "Then we'll be ready." The night crept in, dragging with it an uneasy stillness. Caleb sat on the porch steps, the rifle across his lap, listening. The desert wind rattled the dry brush, but no engines rumbled in the distance. Not yet. Inside, Lila paced the small living room while Eli sat hunched in a chair, his face pale and drawn. "They'll be back," Eli muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Caleb didn't turn. "I know." Eli's eyes darted toward the door. "You don't get it, they won't stop until they make an example out of you. And me." Caleb finally stood and faced him. "Then it's time they learn this place isn't theirs to control." Eli looked away, shame etched into every line of his face. "You don't know what they're capable of." "I know exactly what they're capable of," Caleb said, his voice calm but firm. "And I also know fear is what keeps them in power. Break that, and they lose control." Lila stepped closer. "What are you planning?" "Stopping them before they get the chance to hit us again." She blinked. You're going after them? Caleb nodded. They'll come, but not right away. They'll want to make a show of it. That gives us time. Eli stood suddenly. You can't take them all. Not alone, Caleb admitted, looking directly at Eli. But I don't think I have to. The younger man's shoulders sagged, his eyes flickering with conflict. Caleb knew Eli wasn't ready to pick a side yet, not completely, but he also knew fear had already started to lose its grip. An hour later, Caleb walked the perimeter of the property, setting makeshift traps with barbed wire and trip lines. Lila followed, handing him tools and supplies. I can't believe this is happening, she said, her voice hushed. It's been happening for years, Caleb replied. Most people just didn't see it, or didn't want to. She stopped, watching him drive a wooden stake into the ground. And what about after this? After they're gone? Caleb paused, looking at her. Then it's up to this town to decide what kind of place it wants to be. And you? He hesitated. I don't know yet. Before she could respond, Eli appeared, carrying a shotgun. I'm in, he said, his voice steadier than before. Caleb studied him for a moment, then nodded. Let's get to work. The first bike roared into the clearing just after midnight, its headlights cutting through the dark. Then came another. And another. Caleb stood near the porch, rifle raised. Eli crouched beside him, his shotgun ready, while Lila kept low inside the house. The iron fangs spread out, their numbers larger than Caleb had expected, at least a dozen this time. Zeke led them, his eyes burning with fury, and Roy lingered just behind him, calm and calculating. This ends tonight. Zeke shouted. Caleb stepped forward. You're right about that. Zeke revved his engine, but the moment he hit the gas, his bike's tires skidded out, tangled in the barbed wire Caleb had stretched across the entrance. The bike flipped, throwing Zeke hard onto the ground. The others hesitated, but Roy barked an order, and they charged. Caleb fired into the air, forcing them to scatter. Eli picked off a tire, sending another biker sprawling. Chaos erupted. Engines roared. Shouts echoed. Caleb moved fast, taking cover behind an old truck as bullets struck the metal. He fired back, dropping one of the bikers who had tried to flank him. Inside the house, Lila fired her pistol through the window, shattering the side mirror of a bike and forcing its rider to bail. Zeke staggered to his feet, blood streaming from a cut on his head. He grabbed a crowbar and charged at Caleb, but Caleb dodged and swung the butt of his rifle into Zeke's stomach, sending him crashing to the ground again. Roy, however, stayed back, watching. You're done, Roy. Caleb shouted. But Roy just smirked. Not tonight. Before Caleb could react, Roy turned and sped off, leaving his men to fend for themselves. The bikers faltered without their leader. Some tried to fight, but others panicked and fled. Zeke lunged one last time, but Eli stepped in, shoving the shotgun barrel into Zeke's chest. Stay down, Eli warned. Zeke's rage flickered into fear, and he finally dropped the crowbar. When the dust settled, the yard was littered with wrecked bikes and groaning men. Caleb lowered his weapon, scanning the scene. It's over, Lila said, stepping out onto the porch. Caleb shook his head. Not yet. An hour later, Roy's tracks disappeared into the desert, but Caleb knew he'd be back. Eli sat on the steps, his head in his hands. I can't believe I helped them for so long. You made a choice tonight, Caleb said, sitting beside him. That's what matters. Lila leaned against the doorframe. So what now? Caleb looked out at the horizon, his jaw tight. We get ready for the next fight. Caleb sat alone on the edge of the porch, the rifle resting across his lap. The first light of dawn crept over the horizon, casting long shadows across the battered yard. The smell of smoke lingered in the air, a reminder of the chaos that had unfolded just hours before. His body ached, but it wasn't the bruises or cuts that weighed him down, it was the silence. The kind that came after the fight, when there was nothing left to do but sit with the memories. Behind him, the screen door creaked open. "You didn't sleep," Lila said softly, stepping onto the porch. Caleb shook his head. "Didn't try." She leaned against the railing, studying him. "You're not just running from them, are you?" He exhaled slowly. "I thought I was. But it's more than that." Lila waited, giving him the space to speak. Caleb ran a hand over his face, feeling the roughness of the stubble there. 3 years ago, my unit was deployed overseas. We were supposed to extract civilians from a combat zone. Simple in and out. But it wasn't. He paused, his throat tightening. "An ambush," he continued. "We got pinned down. My team, my closest friend, Ryan, didn't make it." His voice cracked, and he forced himself to push through. "He took a bullet meant for me." Lila stepped closer. "Caleb. I got the civilians out. I did what I was trained to do. But every night since then, I've wondered if it was enough. If it was worth it." He looked up at her. "And when I came back, nothing felt right. So I left. Got on the bike and just kept riding." She knelt beside him, placing a hand on his arm. "You can't keep carrying that alone." He met her gaze, and for the first time, the walls he had built began to crack. "What if I can't let it go?" "Then fight for something else," she said. "Fight for the people who are still here. For Eli. For yourself." Caleb swallowed hard and gave a small nod. He wasn't sure if he believed it yet, but her words planted a seed. Inside the house, Eli sat at the kitchen table, staring at his hands. Caleb walked in and dropped a cup of coffee in front of him. "Drink," Caleb said. Eli blinked and looked up. "What's the point? They'll just keep coming. Not if we stop them." Eli scoffed. "You saw what happened last night. They won't stop until someone's dead." Caleb sat down across from him. "So we make sure it's not you." Eli shook his head. "You don't get it. Roy doesn't just scare people, he owns them. Half this town won't lift a finger to stop him." "Then we give them something to believe in," Caleb said firmly. Eli frowned. "Like what?" Caleb leaned forward. You stood up to them last night. That wasn't easy, but you did it anyway. People saw that, and they're going to remember it. You're not like them, Eli. You never were." Eli's shoulders sagged. "I don't know if I can be who you think I am." "You already are," Caleb said. "You just need to prove it to yourself." The afternoon heat weighed heavy as Caleb and Eli worked to repair the damage to the property. Lila helped, hauling boards and tools, her movements sharp and determined. "We can't stay like this," she said, wiping sweat from her forehead. "Barricading the house won't stop them forever." Caleb drove a nail into place and looked up. "We won't have to." Eli stopped hammering. "What do you mean?" "We're going to them." Lila stared at him. "You're kidding." "No. We hit them before they hit us again." Caleb's eyes hardened. "We end this." Eli stepped back. "I don't know, man." "You do," Caleb interrupted. "You know exactly what needs to be done. And so do I." Lila crossed her arms. "And if it doesn't work?" Caleb met her gaze. "Then we make sure it's worth the fight." Night fell fast. The desert stretched out in every direction as Caleb strapped on his gear. Eli checked the shotgun one last time, his hands steadier than before. "You ready for this?" Caleb asked. "No," Eli admitted. "But I'm done running." Caleb nodded. That was enough. Lila stood on the porch, her expression unreadable. "Be careful." Caleb paused, stepping closer. "I'll be back." She reached for his hand, squeezing it briefly before letting go. "You'd better." Without another word, Caleb and Eli climbed into the truck and headed toward the Iron Fang's hideout. The road ahead felt heavier than ever, but for the first time, Caleb wasn't riding alone. The truck's tires crunched against loose gravel as Caleb and Eli approached the Iron Fang's hideout, a run-down warehouse on the edge of town, half hidden by overgrown brush and rusted fences. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating rows of motorcycles lined up outside like sentinels. Caleb killed the engine and stepped out, the shotgun resting against his shoulder. Eli followed, his fingers tightening around the grip of his weapon. "You don't have to do this," Caleb said quietly, glancing at him. "Yes, I do." Eli's voice was steady now. The fear was still there, but so was resolve. They moved cautiously, sticking to the shadows as they approached the building. Inside, muffled voices and laughter echoed, a party, loud and careless. Caleb knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. He stopped at the side entrance, pressing his ear to the door. "They're distracted," he whispered. "We hit them fast and hard." No hesitation. Eli swallowed and nodded. Caleb kicked the door open. The sudden crash silenced the room. Dozens of heads snapped toward them, and for a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Zeke spotted Caleb and surged to his feet, knocking over a chair. "You've got to be kidding me!" Zeke roared. Caleb didn't give him time to react. He fired a warning shot into the ceiling, and the bikers scrambled for cover. "Where's Roy?" Caleb demanded, his voice cutting through the chaos. No one answered. "Don't make me ask again." Zeke stepped forward, his face twisted with rage. "You think you can walk in here, Ann?" Caleb cut him off, aiming the shotgun at his chest. "Where is he?" "He's not here." Zeke spat. "You're too late." Caleb's gut tightened. "What do you mean?" A slow clap echoed from the back of the room. Caleb turned to see Roy stepping out of the shadows, calm and collected as ever. "I was wondering when you'd show up," Roy said, a smirk playing on his lips. "I gotta admit, I didn't think you'd be dumb enough to come to me." Caleb leveled the shotgun. "This ends now." Roy's smile didn't waver. "You really think it's that simple?" "Look around." Caleb did. The bikers were regrouping, circling like predators. He recognized the shift, fear giving way to anger. "You've got guts, soldier," Roy said. "But guts don't mean much when you're outnumbered." Caleb kept his focus. "Neither does loyalty to a coward who hides behind other men." Roy's eyes darkened. "Careful, Walker. You don't know who you're dealing with." "Oh, I know exactly who I'm dealing with," Caleb said, stepping closer. "A bully who preys on fear because he's too weak to stand on his own." Roy's composure cracked. "Get him." Zeke lunged first, but Caleb was ready. He sidestepped, swinging the shotgun like a bat and catching Zeke in the ribs. The man crumpled, gasping for breath. Eli fired his shotgun, blowing out the front tire of a bike and sending debris flying. The sudden blast sent the other bikers into disarray, giving Caleb just enough time to close the distance to Roy. Roy drew a knife and slashed at Caleb, but Caleb caught his wrist and twisted hard. The blade clattered to the floor. Roy swung wildly with his other hand, but Caleb blocked the punch and drove his fist into Roy's stomach. Roy stumbled back, but he wasn't finished. He grabbed a wrench from a nearby table and charged. Caleb ducked under the swing and tackled him to the ground. The two men grappled, fists flying, but Caleb's training gave him the edge. He pinned Roy down, his forearm pressing against the man's throat. "Call them off," Caleb growled. Roy gasped, clawing at Caleb's arm. "Never." Caleb pressed harder. "Call them off." Roy's face turned red, and finally, he choked out the words. "Stop. Stand down." The bikers froze, unsure. Some lowered their weapons. Others hesitated. "It's over," Caleb said, releasing Roy and shoving him aside. Roy coughed and glared up at him. "You think this makes you the hero?" "No," Caleb said. "But it makes you the loser." Eli stepped forward, his gun still raised. "You're done, Roy." Roy sneered. "You really think anyone here's going to back you?" The room stayed silent. Caleb turned to the bikers. "This is your chance. Walk away now, and no one else gets hurt." One by one, they dropped their weapons. Roy's fury boiled over. "You cowards! Don't you see what he's doing?" Caleb looked at him. "No, Roy. They see what you've done, and they're done with it." Roy lunged again, but this time Eli was ready. He stepped between them and raised his gun. "Don't," Eli said. Roy froze. For the first time, Caleb saw fear in his eyes. "You're done," Eli repeated. Roy backed down. The bikers stepped aside as Caleb and Eli walked out. The night air felt heavier, but it carried something else, a weight lifting. They drove back in silence, the warehouse shrinking in the rearview mirror. When they reached the farmhouse, Lila was waiting on the porch. She ran to them, relief flooding her face. "Is it over?" she asked. Caleb met her eyes. "Not yet. But it's close." He looked out at the horizon. For the first time in years, it didn't feel like he was running from something. The morning light spilled over the horizon, casting long shadows across the farmhouse. The yard was still littered with debris, scorched wood, twisted metal, and broken glass, but the air felt lighter, as if the weight of the last few days had finally begun to lift. Caleb stood at the edge of the porch, sipping coffee from a chipped mug. His eyes scanned the horizon, more out of habit than concern. For the first time in a long while, the road ahead didn't feel like an escape route. It felt like a choice. Behind him, the screen door creaked, and Lila stepped out, her hair loose and tousled from sleep. She carried a second cup of coffee and handed it to him. "Quiet morning," she said. "For now." Caleb took a sip, letting the warmth settle his nerves. She leaned against the railing. "Do you think they'll come back?" "Not anytime soon," Caleb replied. "Roy's power is broken. Without him calling the shots, the others won't have the nerve to start something new, not here." Lila let out a slow breath. "Good." Caleb turned to her. "You should leave this place. Start fresh somewhere else." Lila shook her head. "This is my home. I'm not letting them take it from me." A small smile tugged at the corner of Caleb's mouth. "You're stubborn, you know that?" "Maybe. But I'm not running," she said firmly. Caleb's smile faded. "Running doesn't fix much anyway." She studied him for a moment, her expression softening. "So what about you? Are you staying?" Caleb hesitated. The road still called to him, but so did the feeling he'd found here, a sense of purpose. He glanced toward the barn, where Eli was helping repair the damage from the previous night. The kid had changed. He wasn't the same scared boy who'd followed Roy blindly. He was stronger now, steadier. "I might stick around for a while," Caleb said finally. "Help clean up. Make sure things stay quiet." Lila's smile was small but genuine. "I'd like that." Later that afternoon, Caleb found Eli stacking boards by the barn. The younger man paused when he saw Caleb approaching, wiping sweat from his brow. "Thought you'd be halfway to the next town by now," Eli said. "Not yet," Caleb replied, leaning against the fence. "You did good last night." Eli shrugged. "I froze up. If you hadn't been there." "You didn't freeze," Caleb interrupted. "You stood up when it counted. That's what matters." Eli looked down, fidgeting with a piece of rope. "I still don't know what comes next." "You figure it out," Caleb said. "One day at a time." Eli looked up, meeting Caleb's gaze. "What if I mess it up again?" Caleb smiled faintly. "Then you pick yourself up and keep going. That's all any of us can do." Eli nodded, and for the first time, Caleb saw something in his eyes he hadn't noticed before, hope. As the sun dipped low on the horizon, Caleb walked back to the porch, where Lila waited. She had cleaned up most of the mess, but the scars on the land and the house were still visible. "You're really staying?" she asked as he approached. "For now," he said. "And after that?" Caleb looked out at the open road stretching into the distance. I don't know. But I'm done running. Lila smiled softly. Good. They stood in silence for a moment, the breeze carrying the scent of desert dust and wildflowers. Thank you, she said finally. For what? For saving us. For saving my brother. Caleb shook his head. You saved yourselves. I just helped you see it. Lila stepped closer, her hand brushing against his. Maybe. But we couldn't have done it without you. Caleb didn't pull away. For the first time in years, he let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, he'd found something worth staying for.